the Forgotten Warriors. The emergency beacon pierced through the darkness of space, carrying with it the desperate plea of a dying civilization. On the bridge of the Federation flagship Eternal Hope, Admiral Zethkalar stared at the tactical display, with his 4 eyes, each one reflecting the same grim reality. Red markers covered nearly every sector of the galaxy, marking territories lost to the Shadow Collective. The Shadow Collective had appeared 3 years ago from the Outer Rim, a mysterious force of beings that consumed entire star systems and left nothing but empty space behind. Their technology was beyond anything the Galactic Federation had ever encountered. Ships that could phase through solid matter, weapons that turned energy shields into conduits for destruction, and worst of all, an intelligence that seemed to predict every move the Federation made. "Status report," Zethkalar commanded, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had watched his civilization crumble. Commander Veltar, a crystalline being whose body normally glowed with confidence, now flickered dimly. "We've lost the Kepler defense grid. The Andorian fleet has been completely destroyed. The Shadow Collective's main force is advancing toward the core worlds." Zethkalar's tentacles writhed in frustration. The Federation had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years, bringing peace and prosperity to over 1 million worlds. Their military was the most advanced force in known space, equipped with weapons that could crack planets and shields that could withstand supernovas. Yet none of it mattered against an enemy that seemed to exist outside the laws of physics. "What about our allies?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "The Vorthan Empire has withdrawn to their home system. The crystal communes have gone dark. The Machine Collective has shut down all communication." Veltar's voice carried the bitter taste of abandonment. "We are alone, Admiral." Zethkalar turned away from the display and walked to the viewport. Outside, the last remnants of the Federation fleet hung in space like dying stars. 300 ships, all that remained of a force that once numbered in the millions. Behind them, refugee ships carried the survivors of conquered worlds, beings who had lost everything to the shadow that was consuming their galaxy. "Sir," came a hesitant voice from the communications officer, a young Zephyrian whose scales had turned pale with fear. "We're receiving a response to our distress call." "From whom?" Zethkalar asked, hope flickering in his heart for the first time in months. "Earth, sir. The humans." The bridge fell silent. Every being present knew of Earth, the small blue world on the outer rim whose inhabitants had only achieved faster-than-light travel 50 years ago. They were considered primitive by galactic standards, their technology crude, their military laughably small. The Federation had accepted them as members more out of curiosity than any belief that they could contribute meaningfully to galactic civilization. "What do they say?" Zethkalar asked. The communications officer's voice cracked slightly as he read the message. "They're offering military assistance, sir. They say they have volunteers ready to help." Several officers made sounds that might have been laughter if the situation weren't so desperate. The humans with their primitive railguns and chemical rockets, offering to help fight an enemy that had destroyed civilizations with technology thousands of years more advanced. But Admiral Zethkalar was desperate enough to consider even the most unlikely options. "Accept their offer," he said quietly. "What do we have to lose?" 3 days later, the human vessel Iron Will dropped out of hyperspace near the Federation's last stronghold at Proxima Station. The ship was old by Galactic standards, built from steel and ceramics rather than the exotic materials the Federation used. It looked crude, almost primitive, but it had made the journey from Earth in record time. General Marcus Stone stood on the bridge of his ship, looking out at the massive Federation fleet with the eyes of a soldier who had seen too many battles. At 62, he was considered too old for active duty by Earth's military, but when the call had come for volunteers, he had been the first to step forward. Stone was not alone. Behind him stood the members of what Earth Command had officially designated as the Advisory Corps, though the soldiers themselves had taken to calling it the Last Regiment. They were all veterans, men and women in their 50s and 60s, who had fought in Earth's various conflicts over the past 40 years. Officially, they were retired. Unofficially, they were some of the most experienced combat soldiers humanity had ever produced. Colonel Sarah Chen stood at the tactical station, her silver hair pulled back in the same military bun she had worn for 30 years. At 58, she moved with the precise economy of motion that came from decades of leading soldiers in impossible situations. Her specialty was demolitions, but she had commanded everything from special forces units to full armored divisions. Captain Viktor Petrov, at 61, was supposedly too old to fly combat missions. His reflexes weren't what they had been at 25, and his eyesight required corrective lenses. But he had more flight hours than any other pilot in the human fleet, and he understood the psychology of aerial combat in ways that younger pilots couldn't grasp. Sergeant Major Rosa Martinez was the oldest member of the group at 59 and arguably the most dangerous. She had served as a combat medic in 7 different conflicts, but her real talent was close-quarters combat. She could kill an enemy with her bare hands or save their life with equal skill, depending on what the situation required. General Stone, came the voice of Admiral Zethkalar over the communication system. Welcome to Proxima Station. We are grateful for your assistance. Stone smiled at the barely concealed skepticism in the alien's voice. He had heard the same tone from young officers who thought experience was less important than advanced technology. They usually learned otherwise, though sometimes the lesson came at a high cost. Admiral, Stone replied, we're here to help however we can. What's the situation? The Shadow Collective is advancing on 3 fronts. Our tactical. Computers predict they will reach the core worlds within 2 standard days. We have attempted every defensive strategy in our databases, but their technology seems designed to counter our methods. May we see the tactical data? Stone asked. Of course, though I should warn you that our greatest strategic minds have been unable to find a solution. The tactical display appeared on the human ship's main screen, showing the movement of Shadow Collective forces in 3-dimensional detail. Stone studied it for several minutes, his weathered face showing no emotion. Behind him, his officers examined the data with the methodical approach of soldiers who had learned to find patterns in chaos. Interesting, Chen said quietly, zooming in on one section of the display. Look at their formation patterns. Petrov nodded slowly. They're assuming we'll respond conventionally. Mass formations, head-to-head engagement, technological superiority. Martinez leaned forward, studying the enemy movement patterns. They move like they've never faced guerrilla tactics. Stone smiled for the first time since arriving in the system. Admiral Zethkalar, we'd like to make a proposal. Of course, General Stone. We'd like to take a small force and hit one of their advance columns. Nothing major, just a reconnaissance in force. See how they respond to unexpected tactics. There was a long pause before the Admiral responded. General, these beings have destroyed fleets of millions of ships. They have weapons that can phase through any defense and technology that defies our understanding of physics. What could a small human force possibly accomplish? Stone's smile widened. Admiral, in all your battles with them, have you ever tried hitting them where they don't expect it? We have attempted flanking maneuvers and, no sir, I mean really hitting them where they don't expect it. Not with superior technology or overwhelming force, but with tactics they've never seen before. Another pause. What did you have in mind? Give us 12 hours and the ugliest, most expendable ship you can spare. We'll show you how humans fight when we can't rely on having the best equipment. Admiral Zethkalar looked around his bridge at officers whose species had mastered interstellar travel, when humans were still discovering fire. They had quantum computers that could predict the movement of entire star systems and weapons that could manipulate the fundamental forces of the universe. Yet they were losing to an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. Very well, General Stone. You may have the cargo vessel Swift Passage. It's armed with basic defensive weapons and has seen better centuries, but it's space-worthy. Perfect, Stone replied. We'll take our people and be ready to launch in 6 hours. As the human officers began preparing for their mission, Admiral Zethkalar found himself wondering if desperation had finally driven him to madness. He was about to send primitive humans against an enemy that had conquered half the galaxy. But deep in his heart, a small voice whispered that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem came from the most unexpected source. These humans were old Their equipment was crude and their numbers were small. But they had something that the Federation forces had lost in their centuries of technological superiority: the ability to think like underdogs. The Swift Passage was indeed ugly. Built 200 years ago as a mining vessel, it had been converted into a cargo hauler and then into a refugee transport. Its hull was patched with metal from a dozen different worlds. Its weapons were outdated by galactic standards, and its engines made sounds that suggested they might explode at any moment. To General Stone and his team, it was perfect. "She's not much to look at," Stone said as they toured the ship. "But she'll do what we need." Chen ran her hands over the cargo holds, mentally calculating blast patterns and structural weak points. "We can make some modifications, turn these storage areas into something more useful." Petrov examined the ship's sensor array and flight controls. "The maneuvering thrusters are more responsive than I expected, and these old-style controls might actually be an advantage if the enemy can disrupt computer systems." Martinez checked the ship's medical bay and armory. "We've got enough supplies for an extended mission, and the weapons lockers are better stocked than I expected." Stone nodded, satisfied. In all their years of service, they had learned that victory rarely came from having the best equipment. It came from making the best use of whatever equipment you had, combined with tactics your enemy didn't expect. "All right, people," he said as they gathered in the ship's small briefing room. "We're about to find out if the Shadow Collective is as invincible as everyone thinks. Our mission is simple: hit one of their advanced columns hard enough to get their attention, see how they respond, and get back alive to report what we learned." "And if they respond by destroying us?" Petrov asked with a wry smile. Stone's expression grew serious. "Then we make sure they remember the price of fighting humans. Win or lose, we're going to teach them something about warfare they won't forget." The Swift Passage prepared to depart Proxima Station. Admiral Zethkalar watched from his flagship with a mixture of hope and dread. These humans were either about to make a significant contribution to the war effort, or they were about to become the galaxy's most memorable footnote. Either way, the Shadow Collective was about to encounter something they had never faced before: human soldiers who had learned their trade in the hardest school of all: survival against impossible odds. When old dogs learn new tricks, the Shadow Collective. Advance Column moved through space with the confidence of predators who had never encountered effective resistance. 47 vessels of various sizes, their hulls seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it, approached the Kepler junction with the methodical precision that had characterized their conquest of the galaxy. Aboard the lead vessel, the entity, known as Primary Commander, watched its fleet being torn apart by tactics that defied every principle of civilized warfare. The humans had turned the Federation forces into something unprecedented: a technologically advanced military that fought like desperate survivors. "This is impossible," the entity said, its voice carrying harmonics of confusion that had never been heard before in Shadow Collective communications. "Our analysis indicates a 0 probability of success for such tactics." But 0 probability meant nothing to soldiers who had learned their trade in situations where success was never guaranteed. General Stone stood in the command center of Proxima Station, watching his plan unfold with the calm satisfaction of someone who had just proven that experience could triumph over technology. "Admiral Zethkalar," he said quietly, "I believe it's time for the Federation to retake the initiative." The alien commander looked at his tactical displays in amazement. The Shadow Collective fleet, which had seemed invincible just hours before, was now scattered and disorganized. Ships that had conquered star systems were being boarded by mixed crews of humans and aliens working together with deadly efficiency. "All remaining Federation forces," Zethkalar announced, his voice carrying new confidence, "advance to final engagement range. Today we take back our galaxy." The battle that followed lasted 18 hours and became known as the Miracle of Proxima. Federation forces, fighting with human tactics and their own technological advantages, systematically dismantled the Shadow Collective fleet. Ships that had seemed invulnerable were disabled by boarding parties. Formations that had never been broken were scattered by unpredictable attack patterns. Weapons that had destroyed civilizations were turned against their creators by crews who had learned to think like humans. Primary Commander made its final stand aboard the Void Reaper, surrounded by the remnants of its crew and facing a boarding party led by Sergeant Major Martinez. The entity was massive, radiating dark energy that could disintegrate matter at the molecular level, but it was also alone and confused. "You have destroyed everything," it said, its voice carrying the weight of a species that had known only victory. "We were perfection. We were inevitable." Martinez looked at the creature with the tired eyes of someone who had faced down too many enemies who believed they were invincible. "You were good," she admitted, "but you made one mistake. You forgot that sometimes the best way to solve a problem is to hit it with something it's never seen before." The final confrontation lasted only minutes. When it was over, the Shadow Collective's command structure was broken, its fleet scattered, and its invasion of the galaxy ended. In the aftermath of the battle, as rescue ships moved through the debris, field and medical teams treated the wounded, Admiral Zethkalar found General Stone standing alone on the observation deck of Proxima Station. The human was looking out at the stars, his weathered face showing the exhaustion of someone who had just fought one battle too many. "General," the Admiral said quietly, "the Galactic Council wishes to offer humanity a permanent position on the inner circle of governance. Full membership with all the privileges and responsibilities that entails." Stone smiled without turning around. "That's very generous, Admiral, but we're not politicians, we're soldiers." "Then what do you want?" Stone was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars that now shone freely because the shadow that had threatened to consume them was gone. "We want to go home," he said finally. "We want to teach young soldiers what we've learned, and we want to know that the galaxy is safe for our children and grandchildren." "It is safe," Seth Kalar replied, "because of what you did here." "No," Stone corrected gently. "It's safe because everyone learned that they don't have to face impossible odds alone. The Shadow Collective conquered the galaxy because every species tried to fight them separately, using the same conventional tactics. We won because we combined human experience with alien technology and everyone's willingness to try something new." Over the following weeks, as the galaxy began to rebuild, the story of the Battle of Proxima spread to every inhabited world. It became a legend told in 1,000 different languages, each version emphasizing different aspects of the victory. Some focused on the technological innovations that had made the victory possible. Others celebrated the courage of the boarding parties that had fought hand-to-hand combat in the corridors of enemy ships. Military academies studied the tactical innovations that had turned conventional warfare on its head. But the version that endured, the one that parents told their children and that was carved into monuments across the galaxy, was simpler. When the darkness came and all hope seemed lost, old human soldiers stepped onto the battlefield and taught the galaxy what it meant to fight for survival. General Stone and his team returned to Earth as heroes, though they never really considered themselves as such. They had done what soldiers do. They had protected those who couldn't protect themselves using whatever tools and tactics were available. Captain Petrov returned to his flight instructor position, but now his students included pilots from across the galaxy who came to learn human aerial combat techniques. Colonel Chen established an engineering school that taught the creative application of simple technologies to complex problems. Sergeant Major Martinez trained mixed-species special forces units in close-quarters combat and survival tactics. But perhaps the most important change was in how the galaxy thought about warfare itself. The Shadow Collective had been defeated not by superior technology or overwhelming force, but by the willingness to think differently. Military academies across known space began teaching courses on asymmetric tactics, creative problem-solving, and the psychology of survival. The humans had given the galaxy something more valuable than victory. They had given them the understanding that there was always another way to approach a problem, no matter how impossible it seemed. Years later, when new threats emerged from the unknown regions of space, they were met not by individual species fighting alone, but by combined forces that used human tactics alongside alien technology. The galaxy had learned the lesson that General Stone and his veterans had taught at such great cost. Sometimes the solution to an impossible problem comes from the most unexpected source, and in the military cemeteries of Earth, simple stone markers, bore the names of soldiers who had given their lives to save a galaxy that had once considered them primitive. The inscriptions were simple, as befitted their subjects. They taught us that age brings wisdom, experience conquers technology, and courage makes the impossible merely difficult. The Shadow Collective never returned. Perhaps they had learned that the galaxy was no longer defenseless. Perhaps they had found easier prey in distant realms. Or perhaps they had simply discovered that there are some enemies too dangerous to face. Enemies who fight not because they are strong, but because they refuse to give up. The last regiment had become something more than soldiers. They had become teachers, showing an entire galaxy that the greatest weapon against despair was the refusal to accept defeat. Their legacy lived on in every mixed species crew that faced impossible odds, in every tactical innovation that turned weakness into strength, and in every young officer who learned that experience and determination could overcome any technological advantage. General Marcus Stone lived to see his great-grandchildren graduate from the Galactic Military Academy, where human tactics were now taught alongside quantum physics and stellar engineering. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 97, surrounded by friends from a dozen different worlds who had learned to fight like humans. His funeral was attended by representatives of every species in the galaxy. The eulogy was simple, delivered by Admiral Zethkalar, who had become one of his closest friends in the years following the war. He taught us that victory is not about having the best weapons or the strongest shields. Victory is about refusing to quit when everyone else has given up. Victory is about finding a way when there is no way. Victory is about being human, even when you're not human. The galaxy was a safer place because old soldiers had refused to accept that their time was over. They had stepped onto one final battlefield and changed the course of history, proving that sometimes the most powerful force in the universe is the simple determination to keep fighting, no matter what the odds. And in the end, that was the most human thing of all. Assess the tactical situation with satisfaction. The Federation forces had withdrawn from this sector entirely, leaving only empty space and a few scattered asteroids. Soon they would control the hyperspace junction that connected 3 major trade routes, cutting off the Federation's remaining forces from their supply lines. The Shadow Collective had conquered 47 different civilizations using the same basic strategy, overwhelming technological superiority combined with perfect tactical prediction. Their quantum processors could analyze any enemy formation and predict optimal responses with 97% accuracy. No force in the galaxy had been able to surprise them. They were about to learn the difference between theoretical combat, analysis, and human experience. The swift passage drifted silently among the asteroids of the Kepler belt, its engines cold and its hull configured to look like just another piece of space debris. General Stone and his team had spent 8 hours carefully positioning their ship where the Shadow Collective's sensors would dismiss it as unimportant. "Contact," whispered Lieutenant Kumar, the ship's young sensor operator. 47 vessels, approaching on Vector 77 Mark 12. They'll be in weapons range in 20 minutes. Stone nodded, studying the tactical display with the calm expression of someone who had been in similar situations many times before. The Shadow Collective ships were impressive, sleek, obviously advanced, and radiating the kind of energy signatures that suggested weapons capable of cracking moons. "Colonel Chen, are your surprises ready?" he asked quietly. Chen smiled, the expression of someone who had spent 30 years learning creative ways to make things explode. "The asteroids are prepared, General. 12 different blast patterns, all designed to channel debris in specific directions. Captain Petrov, how's our mobility?" Petrov ran his hands over the flight controls, feeling the ship's responses like a musician tuning an instrument. "She's not fast, but she's nimble enough. I can get us out of here if things go bad." "Sergeant Major Martinez, are the boarding pods ready?" Martinez checked her equipment one final time. "Ready, sir, though I still think you're all crazy for letting me try this." Stone's smile was the expression of a teacher about to demonstrate a lesson his students would never forget. "Remember, people, we're not trying to win a conventional battle. We're trying to learn how they think and teach them something about how we think." The Shadow Collective column entered the asteroid field exactly as Stone had predicted, their formation perfect for dealing with conventional attacks. Ships arranged in overlapping fields of fire, sensors sweeping methodically, weapons charged and ready. It was textbook military doctrine executed flawlessly. It was also exactly the wrong formation for dealing with what was about to happen. "Execute," Stone said quietly. Colonel Chen's finger found the detonator. Across the asteroid field, carefully placed explosive charges turned 12 large asteroids into thousands of high-velocity projectiles. But these weren't random explosions. Chen had calculated the blast patterns to create specific debris fields that would force the Shadow Collective ships into predetermined positions. The enemy response was immediate and predictable. Their ships moved to avoid the debris, maintaining formation while their point defense systems destroyed the larger fragments. Their tactical computers had calculated the optimal response to an asteroid field trap in microseconds. What they hadn't calculated was that the trap wasn't the asteroids. It was getting them to move exactly where the humans wanted them. "Now," Stone said. The swift passage erupted from its hiding place among the debris, but not in the way any military computer would have predicted. Instead of charging the enemy formation or trying to use the asteroids as cover, it accelerated, directly toward the largest Shadow Collective vessel, at an angle that made no tactical sense. Captain Petrov flew the old cargo ship like it was a fighter craft, using every trick he had learned in 40 years of combat flying. He rolled the ship through debris fields that should have torn it apart, used gravity wells to slingshot around asteroids, and changed direction so suddenly that the ship's inertial compensators screamed in protest. The Shadow Collective ships tried to target the human vessel, but their weapons were designed for precise long-range engagements. The humans were flying so erratically, so close to debris and other obstacles, that getting a clean shot was nearly impossible. "Boarding pod away," Martinez announced, her voice calm despite the fact that she was about to attempt something that every military manual in the galaxy would classify as suicide. The boarding pod was little more than an armored tube with a rocket motor, primitive even by human standards. It had no stealth capabilities, no advanced navigation, no weapons beyond what its occupant carried. What it did have was the advantage of being completely unexpected. The Shadow Collective ship's defensive systems were designed to stop everything, from nuclear warheads to quantum torpedoes. They were not designed to stop what was essentially a flying coffin, with a very determined human inside. Martinez felt the brutal deceleration as the pod's magnetic clamps engaged with the enemy hull. Her vision grayed at the edges, but 30 years of combat experience had taught her to function through pain and disorientation. The pod's cutting laser burned through the alien hull in seconds, and she was inside the enemy ship before their automated defenses could react. The interior of the Shadow Collective vessel was like nothing in the Federation databases. Corridors that seemed to bend space itself, walls that shifted between solid and transparent, and an atmosphere that felt heavy with malevolent intelligence. But Rosa Martinez had fought in environments from Arctic wastelands to burning cities, and she had learned long ago that every enemy, no matter how alien, had weaknesses. She moved through the ship with the silent efficiency of a predator, her combat instincts guiding her toward what had to be the command center. The Shadow Collective crew, if they could be called that, were beings of living darkness that seemed to exist partially outside normal space. They were dangerous, but they were also unused to facing opponents who thought tactically rather than technologically. Meanwhile, the swift passage continued its impossible dance through the asteroid field. Petrov had turned the ship into a mobile distraction, drawing fire away from Martinez while she completed her mission. The Shadow Collective ships were pursuing him with increasing frustration, their perfect formations breaking down as they tried to corner a target that refused to behave, according to tactical doctrine. "General," Chen said, watching the tactical display, "they're getting angry." Stone nodded. "Good. Angry enemies make mistakes." The Shadow Collective commander was indeed making mistakes. Frustrated by the humans' refusal to fight conventionally, he was ordering his ships into increasingly aggressive positions, breaking the defensive formations that had served them so well against every other enemy. It was exactly what Stone had hoped for. On board the enemy flagship, Martinez found what she was looking for, a chamber filled with crystalline structures that pulsed with dark energy. She didn't understand the technology, but she recognized the function. This was the ship's tactical center, where their quantum computers processed combat data and coordinated with the rest of the fleet. She placed her charges with the careful precision of someone who had been blowing up enemy installations since before some of the Federation's officers were born. The explosives were primitive by Galactic standards, chemical-based charges that worked by simple molecular combustion. But sometimes the old ways were the best ways. The explosion tore through the ship's tactical center, and suddenly the perfectly coordinated Shadow Collective formation became 47 individual ships trying to figure out what had just happened. Their quantum communication network had been severed, their tactical computers were offline, and for the first time in their conquest of the galaxy, they were fighting confused and alone. "Pick up in 30 seconds, Petrov announced over the communication system, bringing the swift passage around in a maneuver that should have been impossible for a ship of its size. Martinez ran through corridors filled with alarms and emergency lighting, the Shadow Collective crew finally realizing they had been infiltrated. She reached the extraction point just as Petrov brought the ship alongside and leaped across the gap between vessels with the casual confidence of someone who had made similar jumps under enemy fire, more times than she cared to remember. "Time to go," Stone announced. The swift passage accelerated away from the asteroid field, but not in the direction the enemy expected. Instead of heading back toward Federation space, Petrov flew deeper into the belt, using the gravitational chaos of the broken asteroids to mask their escape vector. Behind them, the Shadow Collective ships tried to pursue, but without their tactical coordination, they were flying blind. 3 ships collided with asteroids, 2 more crashed into each other, and the rest were so busy trying to avoid obstacles that they lost track of their target entirely. 6 hours later, the battered cargo ship limped back to Proxima Station, its hull scarred by debris impacts and energy weapon near misses. General Stone and his team had accomplished something that the galaxy's greatest military minds had declared impossible. They had not only survived an encounter with the Shadow Collective, they had inflicted significant damage and learned crucial intelligence. Admiral Zethkalar met them personally in the docking bay, his 4 eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and hope. "General Stone, we monitored your engagement. How did you—" "Admiral," Stone interrupted gently, "we need to talk. All of us. What we learned out there changes everything." In the station's main briefing room, the human team presented their findings to an audience of the Federation's senior commanders. The aliens listened with growing amazement as Stone explained the Shadow Collective's weaknesses. "They're not invincible," he said, pointing to tactical displays that showed the enemy's response patterns. "They're just used to fighting enemies who think like they do. Their entire strategy is based on technological superiority and predictive analysis. But they've never faced opponents who fight dirty." Colonel Chen stepped forward, her presentation highlighting the enemy's tactical vulnerabilities. "Their coordination depends on quantum communication networks. Disrupt those networks and they become individual ships with no mutual support." Captain Petrov added his observations about their ship designs. "Their vessels are built for specific combat roles, optimized for maximum efficiency in conventional engagements, but they can't adapt quickly to unexpected situations." Sergeant Major Martinez concluded the briefing with the most important intelligence of all. "They're scared," she said simply. For the first time in their conquest of the galaxy, they've encountered something they don't understand. And scared enemies make more mistakes. Admiral Zethkalar looked around the room at his officers, seeing hope in their expressions for the first time in months. "General Stone, what do you propose?" Stone's smile was the expression of a teacher who had just watched his students grasp a difficult concept. "We're going to teach them the difference between fighting a war and surviving one. But we're going to need more ships, and we're going to need your people to learn some very unconventional tactics." "What kind of tactics?" "The kind that primitive humans use when they can't rely on superior technology," Stone replied. "Guerrilla warfare, asymmetric engagement, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to win. As the Federation commanders began planning their first offensive operation in over a year, word spread throughout the fleet about what the human veterans had accomplished. The aliens began to understand that sometimes the solution to an impossible problem came not from advanced technology, but from old-fashioned experience and the refusal to accept defeat. The Shadow Collective had conquered the galaxy by being better than everyone else at conventional warfare. They were about to learn what happened when conventional warfare stopped being the only option. The final stand and new beginnings, the Shadow Collective's response to their defeat at Kepler Junction, was swift and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, they had assembled the largest fleet in their history, over 15,000 vessels of various sizes, all converging on the Federation's last stronghold at Proxima Station. Primary Commander stood on the bridge of the flagship Void Reaper, its form crackling with dark energy as it contemplated the upcoming battle. The humans had embarrassed them at Kepler, using primitive tactics that should have been easily countered. This time, there would be no surprises, no clever maneuvers, no escape. The Shadow Collective would end the Federation once and for all, and make an example of the species that had dared to resist them. All vessels maintain formation, the entity commanded. Deploy void screens at maximum intensity. Activate quantum predictors. These humans will not surprise us again. But General Stone and his team had no intention of repeating their previous tactics. As they stood in the command center of Proxima Station, surrounded by the desperate hope of 1,000 different species, they were planning something that no military college in the galaxy would have approved. The station's shields can hold for maybe 6 hours under that kind of firepower, Admiral Zethkalar reported, his crystalline body flickering with barely controlled panic. Our fleet has been reinforced to 800 ships, but against 15,000. Numbers don't always tell the whole story, Stone replied calmly, studying the tactical displays with the same methodical approach he had used in dozens of impossible situations. Colonel Chen, status on the special preparations? Chen smiled grimly. Every ship in the fleet has been equipped with the modifications we discussed. The crews hate them. They're contrary to every principle of space combat design. But they'll work. Captain Petrov, are our pilots ready? Petrov nodded, though his expression was troubled. They're ready, sir, but I have to say, asking Federation pilots to fly like this goes against everything they've been trained to do. Sergeant Major Martinez, how are our boarding teams? Martinez checked her equipment roster. We've got volunteers from 17 different species. They're scared, but they're angry enough to try anything. Stone turned to face the assembled Federation commanders, beings whose civilizations spanned the galaxy but who now looked to a handful of elderly humans for salvation. Ladies, gentlemen, and others, he began. What we're about to attempt has never been tried before. We're going to turn your advanced fleet into something the Shadow Collective has never encountered. A force that fights like humans. Admiral. Zethkalar's tentacles writhed nervously. General, our ships are equipped with the most sophisticated weapons and defense systems in the galaxy. Surely we should use our technological advantages. Admiral, your technological advantages are exactly what the Shadow Collective is prepared for. They've conquered every force that relied on superior technology. But they've never faced an enemy that deliberately chose to fight with inferior equipment used in creative ways. The first Shadow Collective ships dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the system like harbingers of doom. Their dark hulls seemed to devour light itself, and their weapons charged with energy that made space itself ripple. They moved in perfect formation, their quantum computers calculating optimal attack vectors and defensive positions. All Federation ships maintain position, came the order from Admiral Zethkalar. Prepare for defensive engagement. But Stone had other plans. All human-advised vessels execute Broken Arrow Protocol. Across the Federation fleet, ships began behaving in ways that violated every principle of space warfare. Instead of maintaining formation, they scattered in random directions. Instead of charging weapons to full power, they reduced output to minimum levels. Instead of raising shields to maximum, they configured them in patterns that left obvious gaps. To any military observer, It looked like the Federation fleet was falling apart before the battle had even begun. The Shadow Collective interpreted it the same way. Primary Commander analyzed the chaotic Federation response and calculated a 99% probability of victory. The enemy was panicking, breaking formation, making elementary tactical errors. It would be a massacre. All ships advance to optimal firing range, the entity commanded. Prepare to end this war. The Shadow Collective fleet moved forward with the confidence of predators approaching wounded prey. Their formations were perfect, their weapons ready, their quantum predictors tracking every Federation vessel. In 6 minutes, they would be in range to begin the final bombardment. They never reached firing position. The first surprise came from the seemingly random debris scattered throughout the system, wreckage from previous battles that any competent commander would have cleared away, except this debris had been carefully positioned by Colonel Chen's teams, and when the Shadow Collective ships reached predetermined coordinates, the wreckage exploded. Not with conventional weapons, but with simple chemical charges that turned twisted metal into high-velocity projectiles. The Shadow Collective ships' shields were designed to stop energy weapons and exotic particles, not chunks of steel moving at significant fractions of light speed. Evasive action, Primary Commander ordered, but it was too late. Dozens of Shadow Collective vessels were holed by debris that should have been harmless, their perfect formations disrupted as they tried to avoid the unexpected hazard. The second surprise came from the Federation ships themselves. What had looked like panic and poor coordination was revealed to be something else entirely: controlled chaos. Each ship was moving according to a pattern that made no sense individually, but created a three-dimensional maze of unpredictable trajectories. Captain Petrov's voice came over the tactical communications network, calm and professional despite flying through a combat zone that would have killed most pilots. Remember, people, the enemy's computers predict based on logical behavior, so don't be logical. Federation ships dove through debris fields that should have torn them apart, used gravity wells to slingshot in impossible directions, and changed course so frequently that targeting them required constant recalculation. The Shadow Collective's quantum predictors, designed to analyze rational tactical decisions, couldn't process the seemingly random human approach to combat. The third surprise was the most devastating of all. While the Shadow Collective ships were trying to track erratically moving targets and avoid unexpected debris, they failed to notice the small objects that had been launched from various Federation vessels, objects too small to register as threats on their tactical sensors. Boarding pods, primitive by galactic standards but piloted by volunteers who had learned human tactics in the past few days. Dozens of these tiny craft converged on Shadow Collective vessels, their occupants prepared to do something that civilized species considered barbaric: close-quarters combat inside enemy ships. Sergeant Major Martinez led the assault on the Shadow Collective flagship, her boarding pod burning through the Void Reaper's hull just as it had at Kepler Junction. But this time she wasn't alone. Behind her came volunteers from across the galaxy, Zephyrian warriors whose scales could deflect energy weapons, crystalline beings who could interface directly with computer systems, and others who brought their own unique abilities to the fight. The Shadow Collective crew fought back with weapons that could manipulate matter at the molecular level, but they had never faced opponents who combined multiple species capabilities with human tactical thinking. When energy weapons proved ineffective, the boarding team switched to kinetic attacks. When force didn't work, they used stealth. When stealth failed, they improvised. Command center secured, Martinez reported as her team fought through corridors that defied three-dimensional geometry. Beginning disruption of communication networks. Similar reports came from across the battlefield as boarding teams infiltrated Shadow Collective ships throughout the fleet. Each successful infiltration disrupted the enemy's coordination, turning their perfectly organized formation into a collection of confused individual vessels. But Primary Commander was not finished. The entity had survived the conquest of 47 civilizations by adapting to unexpected situations, and it was already calculating new strategies to counter the human tactics. All ships, execute Omega Protocol, it commanded. If we cannot coordinate, we will overwhelm through individual superiority. The remaining Shadow Collective vessels abandoned their formations entirely and began attacking with the desperate fury of cornered predators. Their individual firepower was still overwhelming, and several Federation ships were destroyed in the opening moments of this new phase of battle. It was then that General Stone played his final card. "All ships, execute, final gambit," he announced calmly. What happened next would be studied in military academies for centuries to come. The entire Federation fleet, including ships that had been pretending to be crippled or fleeing, suddenly converged on the Shadow Collective formation from every possible direction simultaneously. But instead of engaging in conventional ship-to-ship combat, they began ramming enemy vessels. Not suicidal attacks, but carefully calculated collisions that used the Federation ship's superior maneuverability to strike Shadow Collective vessels at precisely the right angles to disable them without destroying both ships. It was a tactic that required split-second timing, perfect coordination, and the kind of desperate courage that came from having nothing left to lose. Captain Petrov led the charge, bringing his command ship alongside a Shadow Collective destroyer and using magnetic grapples to lock the vessels together. "If you can't outgun them," he announced over the communications network, "grab them and don't let go." Federation crews boarded enemy ships through airlocks that were still connected, continuing the fight in hand-to-hand combat through corridors and chambers where energy weapons were too dangerous to use. It was brutal, primitive, and completely outside the Shadow Collective's experience. Primary Commander,